Fantasy football season is almost here, but there is still time to talk strategy. So for today, I'm going to give you my tips for drafting a defense. Yes, a defense, so bear with me. I know many of you will just say, oh, I just stream defenses. But I think a little bit of strategy can help make our draft as effective as possible. Last year, 11 defenses averaged 8 fantasy points or more, according to Fantasy Pros scoring. In per game half PPR leagues, that was the same as Drake London, Ezekiel Elliott, Devin Singletary. And I'm not telling you to draft a defense over those guys. And drafting a defense doesn't have the same make or break consequences as your first round wide receiver or your favorite sleeper running back. But drafting the right defense can help you win a week or help maximize the effectiveness of your lineup for multiple weeks during the season. So let's dive into my top 5 rules for drafting a fantasy football defense. Rule number 1, never be the first person to draft a defense. Yes, if you have the first pick in the last round or the second to last round and nobody's drafted a defense yet, you can obviously be the first person to draft a defense. However, there are some people that will tell you it's okay to reach early to draft the defense you really want, but the data just doesn't back that up. In 2017, ESPN analyzed 15 years of ADP data and found that only 2 times had a defense who was drafted first, second, third, or fourth according to ADP in a given year finished that year as the top overall defense. That means just 2 of the top 60 defenses drafted in those 15 years wound up as the top scoring fantasy football defense. Those are atrocious odds of landing the top defense just because you draft the first defense, and things really haven't gotten better in recent years. Last year, 6 of the top 10 defenses at the end of the year were drafted after the top 5 defenses were already off the board. 2 of the top 10 defenses last year were actually drafted outside of the top 10 overall defenses. Generally, we want to avoid things that have just a 3.3% success rate, so I really don't recommend jumping rounds early to be the first person to draft a defense. Rule number 2, never draft more than 1 defense. Now, I know the stats I just read to you in rule number 1 might have you thinking, well, if I just draft 2 defenses, then I can play matchups early in the season. And my answer to that would simply be no. While late in the season, I do like holding 2 defenses so that you can play matchups. At that point, we kind of know the player pool overall. At the beginning of the season, I really don't recommend holding 2 defenses. I'd much rather use that roster spot for a lottery ticket at running back or wide receiver until we get a better sense of how snap shares and target shares are going to play out in every single offense. Rule number 3, when in doubt, hunt for turnovers. Every single week, I put out my BOD rankings, that's best overall defense. It's based on a formula I use where I look at a lot of the underlying metrics that I prefer, things like pass rush win rate, quarterback hit rate, passes defended, explosive play rate allowed, and I try to use those stats to tell me what defense is playing really well on the field, not just putting up good fantasy point totals. This offseason, I went back over all of those stats and I ranked each team 1 through 32 based on their performance. Then I looked at the top 10 overall defenses last year, and I tried to see how many times they finished top 10 in any of the stats that I had used for my rankings. 5 of the top 10 defenses in 2023 finished inside the top 10 in explosive play rate allowed and finished inside the top 10 in quarterback hit rate. However, 7 of the top 10 defenses last year finished inside the top 10 in turnover rate. Now, I know that might not surprise you, but it's important to note that that's better than sack rate or sack totals, and that's the exact same as scoring rate leaders. So what that means is if you're deciding between 2 defenses, a defense's turnover rate is actually more valuable than their sack totals and equally as valuable as how many points they will allow. So turnover rate is a really good way to decide a tiebreaker between 2 defenses, not just looking at how many points a defense will allow. Rule number 4, plan just 2 or 3 weeks at a time. When I do my weekly rankings I post on Reddit, I get so many comments about set it and forget it defenses, and I really dislike that term. It's incredibly rare to find a defense like that just over the course of a whole season, and it is almost impossible to find a set it and forget it defense coming out of your draft. Sure, it would be great to land the 2023 Raiders, who were drafted as the 17th defense off the board and finished 7th at the end of last year. However, before week 8, the Raiders defense averaged just 4.4 points per game, and they scored a total of 6 points in the first 4 weeks. You would almost assuredly have dropped them by that point in the time and then had to go to the waiver wire to pick them up to get all of their success in the second half of the season. And there are examples like that every single year. More often than not, the best defenses emerge as the year goes on. You can find solid units that will give you solid foundational scores every single week, but finding the top defense or a set it and forget it defense is incredibly rare. To me, that doesn't mean streaming every single week. It means managing your risk and finding defenses that have at least solid matchups for multiple weeks. If I'm streaming every single week, I'm spending waiver money or using my waiver priority every single week to try to pick up a good defense. That waiver money could be really useful at the end of the year if I'm trying to fill in for an injured quarterback or running back or wide receiver, etc. So early in the season, I really don't want to be blowing that much money on the waiver wire just to pick up my defense. Rule number 5, draft with week 1 in mind, but don't overrate it. I know a lot of people like to go into their draft and say, I'm just taking the defense with the best week 1 matchup. And I think that is important, but I really don't want to be, again, making a waiver claim right after week 1 to add another defense. So for example, the Saints play the Panthers in week 1, and we really like that matchup. But then they get the Cowboys and the Eagles in the next 2 matchups, which means you're going right to the waiver wire after week 1 if you draft the Saints. Instead of drafting solely for week 1, I'd look at teams that have good schedules over the first couple of weeks, like the Seahawks, who play the Broncos and the Patriots in the first 2 weeks, so you'll hold them at least until week 3, or the Chargers, who open up the year with matchups against the Raiders, Panthers, and Steelers, so you're not looking for another defense until week 4. I'm not saying you should take these over top-tier defenses. If top-tier defenses fall in your lap, you can take them and take their 4 or 5 points in a bad week in the first couple of weeks of the season. But I'm just saying, let's try not to draft strictly because of a week 1 schedule. So with all that said, who are the defenses that I'm looking to draft in my fantasy football drafts this year? Well, I'll just say, if any of the Cowboys, 49ers, or Steelers fall into my lap, I'm more than happy to take them because I think they're strong defenses and I'm not at all worried about their early season matchups. I'll still also probably take the Jets and the Browns if they fall to me, but I have a little more concern over their week 1 matchups. The Jets get the 49ers and the Browns get the Cowboys, and I don't love those matchups, but I do love those defenses, so I'll take them and hope that they get just a passable score in the first couple of weeks. If I don't get the opportunity to take any of those 5 defenses, I really like drafting the Texans. They're my 7th ranked defense headed into this season, and they get the Colts, Bears, Vikings, and Jaguars to start the year. I really like those 4 matchups. I also like the Packers as a fringe top 10 defense this year. They don't get a great first matchup against the Eagles. However, their matchup after that are the Colts, Titans, Vikings, Rams, and Cardinals. So I'm willing to kind of eat what I think will be a mediocre performance against the Eagles for those 5 matchups that I'm going to get after that. In deeper formats, I'm also targeting the Seahawks and the Chargers, who I mentioned before. And I think that you could also look at the Broncos as well. They get the Seahawks, Steelers, Bucks, Jets, Raiders, Chargers, Saints, and Panthers in their first 8 games. There are really none of those teams that I'm really running away from. The hardest matchup would be the Seahawks, but the Seahawks have Tyler Lockett banged up heading into week 1, and I'm not really sure that's a matchup I need to avoid with that Broncos defense. Under no circumstances do I see myself drafting the Chiefs or the Jaguars unless I'm in some weird 2-defense league, because I really don't like their first week 1 matchups. I can't see playing them in week 1, and like I said before, I'm not going to carry 2 defenses, so I'm not rostering a defense in week 1 that I can't play that week. Hopefully some of this was helpful. I'll be back here every single week with my Pick 3 DST video where I give you 3 defenses I like and 1 defense I'm fading, and hopefully will help lead you to some success and some championships in the 2024 fantasy football season. Happy drafting.